What does that mean on the ground? It means that by 19 picture Warsaw in 1960. Not the Warsaw that was rebuilt from rubble, not the city of trams and reconstruction and stubborn Polish life reasserting itself from the ashes. Picture a different city entirely. The street signs are in German now, have been for 15 years. The old neighborhood names, Praga, Śródmieście, Wola, don't appear on any official map. The city has a new name. The few remaining residents who remember the old one don't say it out loud. Not anymore. And those residents are few because what's happening here, quietly, bureaucratically, with the same efficiency that built the Autobahn, is that the people who belong to this land in this new order are being replaced. Not all at once. That would be inefficient. Methodically, the way you drain a field. I'm Cody, and what I want to do today is walk you through something genuinely unsettling. And not because I think alternate history is entertainment, but because I think the specific details of what Nazi Germany was planning, what they had already begun, and what a world under their victory would have actually looked like tells us something essential about the world we do live in. Not vague theoretical horror, documented, bureaucratic, filed in triplicate. The thing most people misunderstand about Nazism, and I think this is worth slowing down for, is that they tend to see it as a political movement that went too far, a normal government that got extreme. But that framing misses what it actually was. A complete civilizational reinvention, not a party platform, a cosmology. The Nazis weren't trying to run a state better, they were trying to restructure the biological and cultural order of the entire human world. And if they had won everything, every institution, every loyalty, every street sign, that would eventually have been bent toward expressing that order. At the center of that order was a racial hierarchy so detailed and bureaucratized that it had official categories with different legal statuses, different caloric rations, different rights and futures. At the top, Aryans, ethnic Northern Europeans, specifically Germanic peoples, who were seen as the biological engine of civilization itself. Below them, as sort of junior partners, came the people the Nazis categorized as Nordic adjacent, Scandinavians, Dutch, Flemish, then in contested middle ground, Mediterranean Europeans, Italians, Spanish, people whose political value to the Reich was in tension with their racial ambiguity in Nazi ideology. And then the vast disposable bottom, Slavic peoples, Poles, Russians, Ukrainians, Czechs, who had been officially designated as subhuman, Untermenschen, a word that had legal and logistical consequences, and then intended for total elimination, Jewish people, Roma, and others. This isn't an abstraction. These categories were written into law, argued over in policy documents, and were already being implemented in the occupied East before the war ended. The genocide was not the result of the war spinning out of control. It was the purpose of the war, the opening act of a longer project. That longer project had a name, General Plan Osid, the general plan for the East. It was a colonization blueprint, and the numbers in it are staggering, and I want to be careful to let them land, rather than just cite them. The plan called for the removal, enslavement, or death of somewhere between 30 and 45 million people across Eastern Europe and the occupied Soviet Union within roughly 20 years. Poles, Russians, Ukrainians, removed from the land to make room for German settlers. Some would be used as slave labor, some would be allowed to survive in diminished controlled numbers to serve as a permanent underclass. Others were simply designated for elimination through what the Nazis called the Hunger Plan, a deliberate starvation policy targeting Soviet cities, particularly non-German populations, to redirect food to German war needs and accelerate demographic replacement. This was policy, written down, argued over by officials who went home to their families at night. In the alternate timeline where Germany wins, let's say through a different outcome at Stalingrad, or a negotiated peace in the West in 1941, or a successful Operation Sea Lion, the specific hinge point almost doesn't matter. What follows from any of those scenarios is the same. The machinery of the new order moves from war footing to administrative implementation. The Einsatzgruppen that were already doing their work in the occupied East become normalized, institutionalized, and General Plan Ost moves from a war planning document to a peacetime administrative priority. 60, the Warsaw one described at the opening, is not a dark fantasy. It is the logical outcome of documented policy. The city's population, which in our timeline was already devastated, reduced from over 1 million to tens of thousands by German occupation, would in this timeline have been reduced further, not through one catastrophic event, but through layered mechanisms, food restriction, labor deportation, population transfers that move German settlers in as Polish residents are moved out or worked to death. The land in Nazi planning documents was called living space, Lebensraum, and the people already living on it were, in the most literal bureaucratic sense, irrelevant to that designation. Hitler drew direct comparisons to the American West. He said it explicitly, Germany's East would be Germany's frontier, the way the American frontier was colonized. He cited the treatment of indigenous peoples, the reservation system, as a model, not as a horror story, as inspiration. That historical parallel is worth sitting with because it tells you that what the Nazis were planning was not unprecedented in human history. It was an acceleration and systematization of something that had happened before, with different victims and different perpetrators. And the scale of the replacement was real. Himmler's planning documents described German colonial towns every 50 kilometers across the occupied East, German farmers on Ukrainian land, German schools in Belarusian cities. In the language, Ukrainian, Polish, Russian, slowly strangled out of public life through administrative pressure, restricted education, and generational replacement, not through a single dramatic erasure, but through the slow suffocation of a culture across decades. Your grandparents spoke Polish. Your parents were allowed to speak it at home, quietly. You grew up in a German school. Your children won't remember there was another language. Now I want to zoom out for a second to the political geography of this new world, because the internal tensions of the Nazi Empire are genuinely fascinating and revealing, because it wasn't going to be a stable order, even on its own terms. Take Italy. Mussolini and Hitler were allies, obviously, but their alliance was always complicated by the fact that Italian fascism and German Nazism had real ideological differences, and the central one was race. Mussolini's movement was nationalist, but not biological determinist in the same way, and the Italian people in Nazi racial theory occupied that uncomfortable middle ground. Mediterraneans, not Untermensch, not Aryan, useful, politically allied, but in the internal documents, the dinner table conversations recorded by people close to Hitler, not equal, not trusted. Southern Europeans in this worldview carried diluted Roman legacy, a complicated inheritance. In a post-war New Order, that tension doesn't disappear. Italy would be a junior partner in a hierarchy that quietly regarded it as lesser, and Italian fascism's own racial nationalism would chafe against that. Spain under Franco similarly, though ideologically aligned but racially categorized. The New Order would have been a pyramid built on resentment, with Germany at the top insisting on a racial logic that most of its allies found insulting when they understood what it actually meant for them. And then there's the question of Britain. In some alternate timelines, this is where the scenario really diverges, because Britain in some versions of this makes a deal. A negotiated peace in 1940 or 1941. Churchill out, a government willing to accept German dominance of the continent in exchange for preservation of the empire. What does that Britain look like? It's a strange, uneasy thing. Technically sovereign, practically subordinate. Its empire left nominally intact, but with German commercial dominance threading through it, its culture quietly pressured, its Jews already gone or in the process of being gone, and the people living in it going about their lives under a government that made that deal. What does it do to a national identity to comply with that? If you found any of this worthwhile, this kind of deep dive into documented history and the worlds that almost were, I genuinely love it if you subscribed. There's so much more of this to come. This is the kind of history I think about constantly, and the comment section on these videos has some of the best historical thinking I've encountered anywhere. You can hit the subscribe button, leave a like, and you become part of an ongoing conversation about understanding how the world we have came to exist. Back to the alternate world, because there's one aspect of the Nazi project that almost nobody talks about when they imagine this scenario, and I think it's among the most revealing: the church question. People tend to imagine that in a Nazi-dominated Europe, the big ideological battles are over race, and they're not wrong. Race is the foundation. But the Nazis also had a plan for Christianity, and it was not a tolerant one, and this wasn't speculative. It was already underway before the war. Hitler's private views on Christianity, recorded extensively in the Table Talk documents and corroborated by people close to him, were contemptuous. He regarded Christianity as a Jewish invention, a poison introduced into European civilization that had weakened Germanic culture with ideas like mercy, humility, and universal human worth. He was not an atheist in any conventional sense. He had something closer to a vague naturalistic mysticism, but he was genuinely hostile to the institutional church, both Protestant and Catholic, though the Catholic Church especially, because of its international structure, its loyalty to Rome rather than Berlin, its independence from state control. In the occupied territories, the Catholic Church was already being systematically dismantled by 1942. Clergy arrested, monasteries closed, church property seized. Polish Catholic institutions, which the Nazis saw as a vehicle for Polish national identity and therefore doubly threatening, were specifically targeted. This wasn't soldiers committing random violence, this was policy. Himmler's SS had a whole department for it. In a post-war Nazi Europe, this trajectory continues. The church question becomes the next item on the administrative agenda after the Jewish question has been resolved. The process is gradual, and it has to be, because even in a Nazi Germany, the population is still largely Christian, and you can't move too fast without backlash. But the direction is clear. Solely close the seminaries, restrict religious education for children, replace the cross with a swastika in public spaces. This was already being done in some German contexts. Introduce what some Nazi ideologues called positive Christianity, a hollowed-out, state-controlled version of the religion that removes Jewish origins, emphasizes warrior values, and centers loyalty to the Reich, and gradually, across generations, phase out institutional Christianity entirely, replacing it with a kind of state neo-paganism centered on German racial mythology. The cult of the blood, the soil, and the Führer. The cross comes down. What goes up in its place is a symbol of total loyalty to a state that has now replaced every prior institution, church family loyalty beyond the nuclear unit, regional identity, class solidarity, with the single consuming identity of racial Germanic belonging. And even that belonging is contingent. Even Germans who don't perform the right ideology, who harbor doubts, who shelter enemies of the Reich, they find out that citizenship in this order is not a right. It's a performance. It always has to be renewed. Before I wrap this up, drop a comment below and tell me, if you had to pick this single moment you think most determined the outcome of World War II, what would it be? I'm genuinely curious what this community thinks about that. So what does sitting with all of this teach us? What is the actual value of going through it this carefully? I think it's this. The world we live in is contingent. It didn't have to be this way. The defeat of Nazi Germany, which we sometimes treat as inevitable, as if of course the Allies won, as if history had a moral logic that guaranteed the right outcome, was not inevitable. It was close. It required specific decisions by specific people in specific moments. It required the Soviet Union absorbing losses so staggering they're almost impossible to comprehend, in over 27 million dead and continuing to fight. It required Churchill refusing a peace deal that part of his own cabinet wanted to take. It required decisions at Stalingrad, at El Alamein, at Midway, and the reason to understand what was planned. The Hunger Plan, General Plan Ost, the church question, the racial hierarchy with its bureaucratic machinery, is not to wallow in a dark alternate future. It's to understand what the Allied victory actually prevented. Not just a political outcome, a civilizational one, the remaking of the entire human order of Europe, and eventually, in the Nazi imagination, the world. Those 27 million Soviets didn't die to preserve national borders. They died and I mean this as specifically as possible, on fighting the thing I've been describing today, the machinery that was already running, the plan that was already being implemented, and the world on the other side of their sacrifice is the one we actually live in. Streets with their original names, languages still spoken, churches still open, cultures still existing that were, in the documented planning of the Nazi state, scheduled to disappear. The horror of the alternate timeline is real, but so is the weight of the actual one. The weight of what was prevented and the specific human cost of preventing it. That's what I think alternate history, done seriously, can give you. Not entertainment, not a dark thrill, the ability to see the world you inhabit more clearly, to understand that the things you might take for granted, the ordinary texture of a culture, a language, a faith, a name, were not guaranteed. We're in fact targeted, and that mattering, that's where I want to leave this for now. Because this is only the beginning of what I want to explore about this alternate world. There's more. The economics of the slave empire, the internal politics of the SS state, what a Nazi space program looks like, what happens when the ideology eventually faces the contradictions it built into itself. We're just getting started, but for today, let that specificity sit with you. The plans were real, the hierarchy was documented, and the world that didn't happen is the reason you're able to watch this at all.